May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Please be seated. Well, in January, I had the opportunity to stand and look out over the Jericho Road, the place where the parable that we just heard. This place, it's desolate, it's rocky, it's dusty, and there are ditches and ravines everywhere. And so as I stood looking out over this wilderness, this particular parable came alive to me in new ways. And I imagine if I asked any one of you, you could tell me this story without even looking at your bulletin. And you've more than likely understood this story as this profound example of how we are to treat each other regarding his neighbor, not merely those who are close to us, or look like us, or believe like us, but rather anyone who is in need. And given the political and social unrest that we've been experiencing as a nation and globally, the latest news feeds, op-eds, and articles decrying the conditions of refugees in immigration detention centers that house children, the reading of this particular parable seems even more timely. Specifically, Jesus' parting words to the lawyer to go and do likewise. You know, it's interesting that we call this parable the parable of the Good Samaritan because he would have been considered a total loser by the Jewish community. So who is this man, this Samaritan? And what does he do that might not be so obvious given this story's familiarity? Well, let's begin by taking a look at him. Unlike the first two characters that Jesus introduces, religious elite, both upright and faithful Jewish men who were living their lives according to the law in order that they might have eternal life, I imagine they think of themselves as winners. The Samaritan, on the other hand, at least in the eyes of the first two, would be considered an outcast, trash, hated because of his religious beliefs, where he lived. Much like Jesus himself was despised and rejected and considered an outcast. And then we have the man who fell among the thieves, lying by the side of the road. The side of the road was more than likely a big ditch, nothing like the roads that we have. And some scholars think that presumably this was a Jewish man that was fell upon by the thieves. And if the religious folks had bothered to really see him, they might have realized that he was one of their own. His unfortunate circumstances, however, made him unrecognizable. So he might not as well have been a Jew at all. The Samaritan, however, has no such problem. He goes to the man who is on the ground in the ditch and involves himself beyond being nice, asking if he can call for help, or doing just the right thing. Because the first thing that he does is he sees this man in need. He truly sees him, particularly when he was invisible to the priest and Levi who passed by. And although they did see him, they ignored him. So they really didn't see him at all. They didn't see him as a neighbor, rather perceived him to be a burden and perhaps even a threat. Second, the Samaritan not only sees the man in need as a neighbor, but he draws near to him. He comes close to him. He closes the divide so that he can offer help. The other two gave this man in need a wide berth. And in fact, we hear in our parable that they actually crossed the road so they wouldn't have to be near him. But the Samaritan goes right to him and becomes vulnerable in that closeness. Vulnerable, should it be a trap, and that was very likely because there were lots of places, and still are lots of places, to hide on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. But even more so, coming close to him, he opens himself up to see this man's pain and misery and his need. And then after seeing him and coming close, the Samaritan has compassion on him, tending his wounds, transporting him to the inn, making sure he is taken care of, not concerned that his wife is going to call him on those charges on his visa bill. Seeing is vital. Drawing near is imperative. And yet the final and meaningful gesture is that the Samaritan actually does something about it. Compassion in this sense is sympathy put into action. He lays down his life for someone who isn't a friend, someone he doesn't know, simply because he, as an outcast, has found someone who does live in his own neighborhood, namely the place where the discards of society reside, the last, the least, the lost, and the despised. And so these three interrelated moves, seeing, drawing near, and having compassion, they offer us an example of what it is to be Christ-like. For God in Jesus saw our vulnerability and need, and he drew near to us in the incarnation when he came down to earth to be one of us, to embrace us. And in the cross, he took action by identifying with us to the very end and rising again so that death could no longer dominate us. And by his actions, the Samaritan identifies with Christ. I have to say, though, in reading the passage this week, I was struck by something again that I've noticed before, but it took on new meaning this time around. And that's quite simply how odd and interesting it is that Jesus chose a Samaritan to be the protagonist and good example in this parable. What I'd always imagined was that Jesus chose a Samaritan to make his point painfully clear to the lawyer testing him. If even a Samaritan can act like this, certainly you who say you seek eternal life should be able to do likewise. And it is indeed a sharp lesson. As when asked who treated the beaten man like a neighbor, the lawyer couldn't even say the name Samaritan, but instead replies only the one who showed mercy. And which is true. The Samaritan did show mercy. And this is the third element of this Christ-like pattern, an example that we discerned earlier. And I think what struck me, though, is that Jesus actually chooses a Samaritan to act like he himself would act. Jesus chooses an outcast to minister to the man in the ditch. And that man in the ditch, some theologians say, is actually a Christ figure, the one who fell among the thieves, particularly if you think about what the Samaritan man did. He anointed him with oil and with wine, and then he lifted him up and put him on his own beast of burden, foregoing his own comfort. And so Jesus identifies one as rejected by his audience to demonstrate God's action in the world. all of this after a group of Samaritans, 2 chapters earlier in Luke's gospel, rejected Jesus and refused to give him a place to stay. Which makes me wonder whether there's another lesson in this parable. Maybe that God often shows up where we least expect God to be. No one expected God to reveal God's glory through the disgrace of the cross. And no one expected or even wanted God to reveal God's power through vulnerability and suffering. Remember, those people were looking for a king, a warrior. That's what happened. So that's probably why Jesus chose a Samaritan, to remind this self-justifying lawyer that there is no self-justification possible. We can't justify our way into heaven. Because the moment we can justify ourselves, we no longer need care about those around us. Because when we justify what we do, it turns out is to struggle to recognize the presence of God in our neighbors, and even harder in our enemies. Because when we fail to see, to draw near, and to help those we mistrust or fear or just want to ignore, hoping they'll go away, maybe because it's just too painful, we risk missing the saving presence of God in our lives and in the world. So who, we might ask ourselves today, do we have the hardest time imagining God working through? Who do you imagine to be lying in this metaphorical ditch by the side of the road? Today's parable, then, is not simply a lesson. I think it's also a promise, friends. Because God comes where we least expect God to be, and he comes for all of us. He even comes for the self-justifying lawyer, and he comes for the outcast Samaritan, the refugee and the immigrant, and those who want to keep them out, those in need, those who help them, and yes, even those who turn away. No one, not one of us, is beyond the pale of God's mercy, beyond the pale of God's grace, beyond the pale of God's redemption. And if you're not sure, keep in mind that at this point in our gospel, Jesus has already set his face to Jerusalem, knowing that he'll not only suffer and die on the cross, but knowing that he's going to do this to show just how far God is going to go to demonstrate God's love, but also to forgive those who crucified him. No one is beyond the reach of God's love. No one. And so Jesus brings this home by choosing the most unlikely of characters to serve as the instrument of God's mercy and grace and exemplify Christ-like behavior, not just a good example. And I think that's what God does. God chooses people no one expects and does amazing things through them. Even a Samaritan, even all of us. In the days and weeks to come, I invite you to consider that God can and will work through each of one of us to do great things of God's grace and peace as his instruments in bringing that about, especially if we come from a place of humility, seeking understanding rather than to be understood by those we perceive as different or a threat. Brothers and sisters, as Jesus charges the lawyer in today's gospel, in these extremely charged and troubling times, he charges us as well to go and do likewise.